Warm ocean waves washed over the bow of the cruise liner as it pushed its way toward the islands. The smell of salt, sun, and adventure filled the nose of everyone on board as they steered toward their destination, the Alolan Islands. Ash and Pikachu leaned over the railings and let the sparkling water fill their sight as they watched frothing waves pass by them. Pikachu looked over at the excited expression on Ash's face as the duo headed to Alola, an entire archipelago of new sights and sounds. The longtime friends were traveling to the destination to expand their skills and meet new and talented trainers. Ash looked over at Pikachu, grabbed the electric Pokemon, and gave him an excited squeeze. Pikachu could feel Ash's excitement in his embrace, and he rejoiced in the ecstasy. The symphony of crashing waves on the wet sand welcomed the new adventurers to Alola as Ash and Pikachu stepped off the cruise liner and onto the pier. Trainers from all around the world travel to this mysterious island chain to collect rare Pokemon, learn new battle techniques, and broaden their knowledge and wisdom from the island kahunas. And Ash was here to do it all. Barely able to contain his enthusiasm, Ash dashed across the pier and ran into the Maritime Market Square. Pikachu deftly chased him down and followed anxiously as Ash maneuvered through the crowded streets to his hotel room. Checking into his room, Ash and Pikachu walked down the hall to their room on the ground floor. Upon entering, Ash flung his bag onto his chair, plopped down onto the bed, but only to bounce right back up onto his feet. He anxiously looked out his window to the jungle trees behind the hotel. Pikachu sensed Ash's eagerness and ran over to the window to catch the view of the wilderness. The call of the birds and the rustling of the leaves in the salty air called them both. Ash looked at Pikachu, who nodded, and they grabbed their adventuring gear and headed out into the thick jungle. The lush fronds swayed in the hot sun as Pikachu followed his dauntless trainer into the wilderness. Looking up to the canopy, Pikachu could clearly see the hot sun splaying its rays across the trees and down onto the ground. Ash came to a clearing and stopped. He pulled out his Pokédex and began listening to its mechanical voice. The machine loaded an image of a small Pokémon onto its screen, and Ash bent down to show Pikachu. Pikachu looked on in wonder as the images danced across the screen, and the Pokédex drawled on about the creature shown. Images of Alola could be seen, as well as different Pokémon that could be found in the region. Excited, Ash stood back up and continued his search for new and wild Pokémon in this Alolan forest. Pikachu gleefully followed his happy trainer deeper into the jungle. Pikachu stayed at Ash's side as they walked through the brush, as they encountered a darker, more covered section of the woods. Ash slowed and looked around. Pikachu climbed up on Ash's shoulders and looked as well. Rustling could be heard from the bushes ahead, and Ash and Pikachu looked at each other in surprise and excitement. Ahead in the dark shadows of the jungle trees, a small Pokemon haphazardly spilled out of the bushes. At first, Ash looked confused, and he waited for the Pokédex to load the screen. Pikachu looked at the Pokemon with wonder and awe. The small little Pokemon looked just like him. However, awe and curiosity turned into an eerie confusion, as something didn't quite look right about the Pikachu in front of the duo. The Pokemon wandered between shady blotches on the ground and wobbled limply to and fro. The Pokemon looked sick and tired, and its eyes stared out blankly. It dragged the tattered cloth disguise hiding it through the sand. Bits and pieces of bramble and foliage dirtied the covering, making the Pokemon look pallid. Fear crept up the small of Pikachu's back watching the feeble-looking Pikachu. It was off-putting to see such a mangy version of himself. Startled by the mechanic ding of the Pokédex Ash was holding, Pikachu clung to his trainer. Ash shushed Pikachu and peeled the startled electric type from his neck as the Pokédex began relaying information about the Pokemon in front of him. Pikachu watched as the Pokédex divulged information about the Mimikyu, a small ghost fairy Pokemon that wanders dark areas by itself. Pikachu immediately felt something off-putting by the imposter Pokemon and stayed on Ash's shoulders as Ash began his preparations to capture this Mimikyu. Pikachu watched from the sanctuary of his owner's shoulder as the shambling Pokemon wandered aimlessly and blindly all around the jungle. Pikachu could sense that the Pokemon was looking for something, and it worried him that he didn't know what it was. Ash was prepared for the Mimikyu, and the capture was quick. Pikachu hopped down from Ash's shoulder as he lay low behind his trainer, and Ash crept toward the unaware wild Pokemon. Pikachu watched the Mimikyu turn to face him, right as Ash threw a Pokeball to ensnare the ghost type. Pikachu thought he could sense the blank eyes looking at him right before the ball enveloped him. Picking up the Pokeball, Ash laughed and placed the ball in his utility belt. Pikachu shook off the creepy feeling from the Mimikyu and happily bounced after Ash to continue on their adventure through the Alolan jungle. The day wore on. Ash and Pikachu found their way to the edge of the jungle to a sandy beach. The duo looked around and took in the view. The gritty sand smelled hot and clean as the sun beat down. The sloshing waves carried the sweet sound of paradise as they lazily flopped onto the beach. Pikachu could sense the smell of salty fish and wet vegetation that completed the beautiful landscape of the Alolan shoreline. Ash stood up straight and let his lungs expand with the savory air. Pikachu followed suit and breathed in as much as he could in one large sigh. Ash looked down at Pikachu, mimicking him, smiled, and then took off running down the beach as fast as his legs could carry him, egging Pikachu on to chase him. Pikachu jumped with ecstasy and took off in pursuit of his friend. The boy and his Pikachu ran down the sandy slope along the water edge, just out of reach of the tickling froth, laughing and breathing heavily. Ash collapsed on the hot sand, and Pikachu jumped into his arms. They sat and watched the sun begin to lie low on the horizon. The colors of the fiery beams of light changed from white to brazen orange. Pikachu could see the monstrous shadow of the cruise liner they took into the island begin to grow and creep across the water, engulfing smaller boats and the pier slowly and relentlessly. Ash took out his Pokedex and began reading more information regarding Pokemon in the area. Pikachu looked over curiously and could see pictures of Pokemon in the water, jungle, and sky scroll across the small screen. The Pokedex changed over to the night section, and images of ghastly creatures lurking in the shadows replaced the small, endearing-looking creatures of the day. Pikachu saw pictures of ghosts, haunted sand piles, and sky creatures with leathery wings. The last image to blink across the screen resurrected the tingling sensation in Pikachu's gut. Ash held the Pokedex up and read the information about the Mimikyu as the sun began to set. Begging to be gazed upon, the sun changed its color into a fiery temper of orange and red. The shadows of the night began to creep closer and closer to Pikachu as he watched all of the people on the pier and beach begin to pack up their day gear and head back into town. Pikachu tugged at Ash's shirt as he sat there reading his Pokedex. Looking up, Ash finally acknowledged the envious sun and put his Pokedex away, stood up, brushed the sand off his clothes, and reached out to Pikachu to take his hand as they walked back to their hotel room. After dinner, Ash sat in his hotel room. The night sky was crisp and breezy and wafted fresh air in through the screen window. Pikachu sat at the sill and watched the trees sway in their slumber and the clouds crawl across the dark nightscape. Pikachu looked away from the shifty shadows and waving fronds to Ash, who was sitting at the table under the humming glow of an electrical lamp. His Pokedex out in front of him, Ash unwaveringly studied the machine, hunched over and mesmerized by the voice and images being played before him. Growing sleepy from the adventure of the day, Pikachu crawled up to Ash and tugged on his trainer's collar. Ash turned, gave Pikachu a warm hug, and ushered the electric type to the bed. Pikachu groggily plopped down onto one of the pillows and watched Ash from behind as he sat back down at the table and continued his research. Pikachu's heavy lids closed gently and seamlessly, and the Pokemon drifted off to sleep. The cold, clammy sensation of dread laid a thick, wet hand on the small of Pikachu's back as his eyes popped open. His fur began to rise as he drowsily moved his gaze. The Pokemon could feel something wrong in the room, and he dared not to move. He looked across the room and could see Ash asleep at the table, the light of the Pokedex casting a blue shadow on the slumbering boy. Pikachu perked his ears and could hear the relaxed, rhythmic breathing of his trainer and the gentle sigh of the sea breeze outside the window. He could hear the buzz of electricity through the walls and the creaking of the hotel walls as it too lay in sleep through the night. As the sense of fear and terror washed over the small Pokemon, his heartbeat began to rise. The blood coursing through his body throbbed loudly in his ears. Deafened by his own blood, Pikachu's vision narrowed as he searched the room for the danger his body was warning him about. Each corner of the room seemed to evilly hide its contents as the blue light succumbed to the strength of the darkness. Pikachu's eyes could see crawling shadows, creeping tendrils, and slithering movements splaying out from each corner to consume the room. Pikachu looked back at his exposed trainer, his back arched over as his head lay on the table, his exposed sides expanding with each restful breath he took. Pikachu was frozen in terror of the thought of those tendrils reaching his owner. Just as the electric type felt that the shadows were going to reach out and grab Ash, a soft rustling sound jerked Pikachu's attention away from his trainer. His hearing returned as the soft noise broke through the night like the cracking of thunder. Pikachu's eyes bolted to the source of the sound. The icy clutches of dread renewed its grasp on the little Pokemon as his eyes made contact with another set of eyes. Unable to move or breathe, Pikachu stared through the dark room across the dim blue glow of the Pokédex, at the eyes peering over at him from the other side of the table. Blank and dead, the eyes stared back at Pikachu. The soft, rustling noise returned as the eyes limply slumped over to one side. Pikachu's eyes descended to under the table, to the source of the eyes. Sitting on the chair opposite Ash was a dirty cloth in the shape of a Pikachu. The Mimikyu sat quietly across from Pikachu's trainer and watched as he slept. Pikachu could not tell if the cloth Pikachu's blank eyes were staring at him or at Ash. A sense of weighted exhaustion flooded the electric type as he lay on the pillow. He could feel his body shut down and slip back into sleep. Pikachu's last glance before slipping away was that of the blank eyes staring. Pikachu's dreams were filled with flashing moments of warm beach sand, laughing and running with Ash, and the beautiful sights of the setting sun. Every image Pikachu's mind conjured up in his slumber was framed with the tendrils of dark shadows reaching out for him and his trainer. Trying to ignore the creeping darkness, Pikachu noticed blank, staring eyes everywhere he looked. In the water, in the sand, in the shadows, the eyes were always watching him and Ash. Waking up in the bright light of the day, Pikachu could feel the warmth of the sun and hear the busy birds and other Pokemon outside. His muscles ached and burned and his mind was groggy and tired, but he managed to pull his head from the pillow and look over at Ash. However, his eyes met only an empty table where his trainer should be. Pikachu uncurled his body and stretched before quickly looking around the room for Ash. Just as the sense of panic began to creep back into the Pokemon, Ash opened the main door calmly and quietly and walked into the room. He sat down the packaged lunch he had made and walked over to Pikachu and gave him a pat on the head. The tendrils of panic and fear shied away as relief spread over the electric type. Pikachu relaxed his tight muscles and plopped back onto his pillow. Ash placed his lunch in his backpack, picked up his Pokédex, and took a Pokéball from his utility belt and called the Mimikyu into the hotel room. Pikachu's relaxed state quickly turned into panic as the Ghost Fairy type appeared from the ball. He jumped up onto his pillow and growled at the Mimikyu, bolts of electricity charging in his cheeks. Ash rushed over to Pikachu and tried to calm him down. Unnerved, Pikachu kept his distance from the other Pokemon and watched its every movement from the corner. The Mimikyu stood mostly still and never made a noise. Ash gathered his adventuring equipment and called both Pokemon to his side. Pikachu obeyed, but made sure to watch the Mimikyu from the corner of his eye. The Mimikyu also followed behind Ash and said nothing. the blank eyes of the disguise, ever looking forward. All three of them left the hotel and went out to enjoy the day. Throughout the day, Ash trained the Mimikyu to follow his lead, learn new moves, and increase the Pokemon's experience. He would have Pikachu and the Mimikyu work together in the jungle to surprise other wild Pokemon so Ash could collect them. Pikachu was hesitant at first to work with the Mimikyu and outright refused in the beginning, which disappointed Ash. So he tried to coerce the Pikachu to be helpful and pleasant towards the Mimikyu. In an attempt to not disobey and upset Ash, Pikachu crept over to the dirty Pokemon and stood next to him. A look of disdain showed on the electric type's face, but Ash ignored his discomfort. Pikachu expected the Mimikyu to do something evil or subversive, but the ghost type was obedient and quiet. Pikachu still never would let this Pokemon leave his sights, and tried not to let the Mimikyu get behind him or his trainer. The day wore on. Exhausted from the activities and the constant anxiety, Pikachu looked over at Ash while he sat at the park and ate his lunch. Pikachu felt a pang of guilt for being so paranoid about the Mimikyu. The thoughts and fears from his dream were a distant memory as the hot sunny day washed over the two of them. It took a minute for Pikachu to notice that the Mimikyu was nowhere to be found. Ash seemed unaware that the ghost type was missing, and Pikachu instantly became worried again. The Pokemon twirled around to see where the ghost type was, hoping that it wasn't sneaking up on them from behind. Pikachu's eyes met with the blank stare of the Mimikyu's disguise from behind a bush. It seemed to be moving around and doing something hidden from view. Angry for hiding and sneaking around, Pikachu ran over to the Mimikyu to expose its secret actions, worried that the Mimikyu might attack him or Ash. Pikachu charged up his cheeks and shot a spark into the bushes, where the Mimikyu was lying in wait. The Pokemon cried out in pain and came barreling out of the bushes. It tripped over its loose disguise and began to whimper and cover itself with its dirty clothing. Pikachu stood over the dropped Mimikyu, ready to strike at him again if he tried any ghostly tricks. But Ash noticed the commotion and ran over to the fight. He quickly scolded Pikachu and pushed him away angrily before reaching from his backpack to bring out one of the hotel towels. Ash placed the towel over the Mimikyu, casting the Pokemon in shadow. Mimikyu stopped writhing and crying out and curled up under the shade of the towel. Ash glared at Pikachu and went back to tending to the Mimikyu. Pikachu stood behind Ash, upset and confused. From behind the towel, Pikachu could see the ghostly Pokemon's blank eyes, staring directly at him. The whole rest of the afternoon, the Mimikyu would not go near Pikachu. Ash also seemed uncharacteristically quiet and broody towards Pikachu. Ostracized from the group for his display from earlier, Pikachu felt bad for upsetting Ash and attempted several times to climb up on Ash's shoulder or to tug on his pant leg. However, Ash would push him away to tend to Mimikyu instead. As the day transformed into evening, Mimikyu became more active and energetic. Ash worked with the ghost Pokemon and listened to notes about it in his Pokedex. Pikachu noticed that Ash was very focused on Mimikyu and didn't even stop when the sun set and turned to night. Pikachu waited patiently for a time when Ash was busy rummaging in his backpack to nudge him and point toward the hotel room. Ash looked at the time, nodded in agreement, and picked up his bag. Ash called the Mimikyu, and it eagerly bounded over to him. To Pikachu's disbelief, Ash picked up the disguised Pokemon and placed him on his shoulder, just like he did with Pikachu. Green with envy, Pikachu sulked behind the duo back to the hotel room. At the hotel room, Pikachu eyed the Mimikyu and stuck to Ash's side. Ash's face was buried in his Pokedex. As the evening passed into night, Pikachu walked over to his pillow. He curled up on the cushion and watched the Mimikyu from across the room. The ghost type sat silently in the chair across from Ash and did not move. Pikachu yawned and thought about how strange Ash acted when Pikachu attempted to thwart the Mimikyu, and when Ash let the Pokemon up on his shoulder. But tired from the activities of the day and the worry of his friend, Pikachu began to slip into sleep. Unable to contain his exhaustion, he succumbed to the temptation to drift away. As his eyes closed for the last time, he thought he noticed dark shadows creeping in from the corners of the room. Pikachu's ears perked up at the sound of a bump in the night. His eyes flickered open to see nothing but darkness. He looked up from his pillow and let his eyes adjust to the lack of light in the room. He could not see Ash anywhere and seemed to be alone. Pikachu quickly glanced over to see if the Mimikyu was still sitting in the chair, but found nothing. He looked out the window, but only saw tangling branches reaching down from the trees. Pikachu did not see tendrils of darkness in the corners of the room. He didn't see dark, blank eyes staring at him from behind the corners of the furniture. The room was completely empty, except for him. The feeling of being completely alone was almost even more disturbing to the Pokemon. He called out to Ash in a quiet, squeaky voice. The deafening darkness swallowed his timid voice, and he stood there, alone. Now shaking and quivering in fear, Pikachu stood in the middle of the room. The silence was beginning to choke Pikachu, and the darkness was pressing down on his trembling muscles. The Pokemon staggered under the weight of the blackness as his legs buckled. Pikachu let out a strangled gurgle to plead for Ash to return. A hushed whisper licked Pikachu's ear as he squeezed his eyes tight. The startled Pokemon's heart began to rush so fast he couldn't breathe. The sensation of the voice filling his brain washed over him like a bucket of ice water. Ash's voice called out his name right next to his head, yet when the Pokemon popped open his eyes, there was nothing but darkness. The electric type looked every which direction he could for the source of Ash's voice, but could not pinpoint this source. A faint rapping against the window of the room drew Pikachu's attention, and he crawled on all fours slowly and painfully toward the windowsill. Pikachu grabbed the ledge and with fatigued muscles drew his small body up to the windowsill. Wide eyes stared at him, and Pikachu almost faltered and fell from the perch. He blinked, and the eyes were gone. Trembling, he looked out past the glass and into the wretched night. In the distance, the fronds of the trees reached out of the darkness to draw him in. The jungle was warm and hungry, its hidden horrors drooling with the anticipation of his soft, little body. Pikachu's head swam with awful images of monstrous Pokemon, unseen terrors, lurking, peeking, and darting in the woods. Unable to look away, the Pokemon stared through the glass, fogging up the pain with his wet, shallow breath. A shadow leaned in towards the electric type just as Pikachu's attention wavered from the jungle. Jumping back from the window, Pikachu looked behind him only to see nothing but the sticky pitch of blackness surrounding him. Paralyzed and afraid to turn away, the Pokemon's mind also bent as he struggled not to leave his back to the jungle. It was the call of his name from Ash that drew the Pokemon back to the window. He heard the voice come from outside, and he thought he could see his trainer outside, entangled by the jungle's snares. Pawing furiously at the latches to the window, Pikachu unlocked the window and darted out of the terrible room and into the outside air. The ghastly sights of night, scratching of insects, and the growls of monsters in the jungle were unsettlingly absent as the electric type jumped into the grass. Feeling the dread of silence gumming up his movement, Pikachu ran into the jungle as quickly as his aching muscles would allow. The moment Pikachu reached the jungle, the calling and screaming of his trainer started overwhelming his senses. Unable to tell where Ash was calling from, Pikachu fled wildly throughout the trees, seeking out the source of his anguished friend. The thick jungle fronds reached out to his warm body, sliced his flesh, and licked the blood from his dripping wounds. Pikachu, maddened with the sound of his trainer calling out to him in pain, pushed through the hungry razors of the branches and into the sandy ferns deep in the woods. Drenched in sweat and leaking blood from several wounds, Pikachu tumbled out of the green nightmare and into sandy solace. The throbbing pain from his muscles and the distant screams of Ash somewhere in the forest besieged the Pokemon's mind. The warm beachfront splayed out in front of Pikachu. No waves crashed on the shores. The still water reflected the stars and the ruddy moonscape. Pikachu's eyes widened at the sight of the horizon reaching far out into the distance. The horizon reached far, far from Alola. Pikachu noticed that the voice of his pained trainer was gone, and the damp silence again smothered the estranged Pokémon. Turning back to head into the jungle once again, Pikachu tripped over something in the sand. He looked down to see a small red toy shovel. He bent down to sniff it, and the succulent aroma of death wafted into his nostrils. Sticky and sweet, the smell clogged his nose, throat, and his eyes. Pikachu coughed and spluttered, sending sand flying in all directions. Itchy with the rocky dirt on his flesh, Pikachu brushed sand from his face and body. He carefully walked around the shovel and gazed back at the jungle. The sound of his trainer calling out to him once more, he dashed into the cutting branches. Following the sound of his voice, Pikachu ran through the jungle, terrified for Ash. He tripped over branches, ran into trunks, and ran through wet, sticky black puddles. When the green fronds gave way to open space, Pikachu stood outside the hotel window he jumped out of not a few minutes before, and he saw Ash inside the room, limp at the table. He jumped up to the window ledge and saw something that froze his body to the core. With the icy clutches of terror, he saw himself asleep on the pillow. He saw the ghostly Mimikyu standing over his trainer, silent and stiff. The ghost Pokémon turned slowly, his blank eyes gazing at Pikachu through the window. Pikachu hit the glass and watched in horror as the other Pikachu's ears perk up at the sound of the bump against the window. Pikachu's ears perked up at the sound of the bump in the night. He lifted his head and looked around. He saw Ash awake and moving about the hotel room. Confused, Pikachu looked out the window and saw the pallid reaches of the sun's light stretching over the branches outside the window. Pikachu looked back at his trainer and could see his fatigued and shallow face as he hurriedly packed his gear into his backpack. The Mimikyu stood silently in the corner, watching behind the disguise's fake eyes. Pikachu yawned and stretched his painfully stiff muscles. His fur was wet with sweat from a nightmare, long lost to his mind. Adjusting his appearance, he looked up at Ash and called to him. Ash ignored Pikachu completely and grabbed his bag, called for Mimikyu, and left the room. Confused, Pikachu followed behind his trainer and left before the hotel room door closed. Following Ash and Mimikyu out of the hotel, Pikachu noticed Ash slouched while he walked and spoke to other people in the hotel quietly and without emotion. Pikachu darted past his trainer and went outside to the warming glow of the sunrise. He turned to see Ash put Mimikyu inside his backpack to hide him from the sun. Ash looked down at Pikachu and gave a weak smile. Pikachu ran over to him to jump into his arms, but Ash shied away and refused to let Pikachu touch him. Pikachu felt betrayed at Ash and envious at Mimikyu. He was convinced that the ghost Pokémon was controlling his trainer somehow and was going to get to the bottom of it. He followed the duo as they walked out past the merchant huts and the pier and onto the sandy beach. Ash and Mimikyu stopped at a small disturbance of sand near the jungle's edge. Ash stooped down, looked at the disturbed sand, and then resumed walking. Pikachu slowly approached the location where his trainer had stopped, and he suddenly felt very nervous, and looked up to see Ash and Mimikyu standing several paces away, staring at him. Ash's eyes were sunken and hollow, but burning bright with some foreign energy. The Mimikyu at his feet was rocking back and forth, his dirty disguise covering his ghostly body. The fake eyes of the Pikachu costume looked at Pikachu with a hungry ferocity. Sticky with sweat, Pikachu felt the most awful sense of something wrong. He looked down to notice that he was standing at the center of the displaced sand. Dried blood and paw prints circled his position. His sweat-soaked fur smelled of dirt and rust. Looking down, he could see scratches along his side and blood dripping freely from his wounds. The warming sun faded as stormy clouds gobbled up the horizon. Looking up, Pikachu could see billions of stars above him. They started to fall down one by one and land on his head. A sea of tiny grains started pouring from the heavens. The tiny glittering specks filled his eyes, his mouth, and his ears. Sputtering and gasping for breath, Pikachu looked over at Ash and Mimikyu. Ash's eyes burned with fervor, but his expression was that of fear and awe. The Mimikyu just stared at Pikachu, and Pikachu felt fear grip his throat, but anger well up inside his chest. Standing before him was his trainer that so quickly replaced him with an imitator. Standing and watching was an imposter that dressed like Pikachu to garner love that didn't belong to it. They stood there watching him suffer and choke as the sandy grains covered him. Furious for all the times Ash rejected him and left him alone, Pikachu could feel pressure welling up against him. The piles of sand began to grow and grow and grow around his body, and he could feel its weight crushing his little bones. Ash and Mimikyu took a nervous step back. Pikachu could sense their fear, and it empowered him. Ash weakly ordered the Mimikyu to stand in front of him, readying for battle. Pikachu felt the sand build high walls around him, and he looked down and saw the little red toy shovel at his feet. He was going to ruin the Mimikyu and take back his trainer from his ghostly possession. Pikachu stood, ready for battle. Ash called out an attack, and the Mimikyu reached out a slender black talon and lashed against Pikachu. The thick walls of sand protected Pikachu as the talon hit. Sand flew everywhere, but Pikachu felt unharmed. He retorted with a blast of sand at the ghost Pokemon. The Mimikyu fell back as the torrent of sand exploded all over him. Mimikyu's Pikachu disguise fell limply to the ground. Pikachu felt a rush of pleasure watching the false Pokemon crumble against the sandblast. Ash took another step back, an expression of concern over his face. He called for another attack from the Mimikyu. The ghost Pokemon rushed forward to tackle Pikachu, his dirty disguise left to blow away in the sand. Pikachu took the hit from the Mimikyu, and the crushing blow dislodged sand from his furry body. He felt empty and cold without the dirt covering his body. He looked at the Mimikyu and reached out to it. Tendrils of wet sand grabbed the ghost Pokemon and held it tightly. Anger, envy, and hatred fueled Pikachu's movements as the sandy tentacles wrapped around the Mimikyu, forcing the Pokemon to dig sand with its bare arms. Weakened from the attack before, the Mimikyu could not resist the brutal strength and strangulation Pikachu's anger had thrust upon it. The Mimikyu dug faster and faster, piling more and more sand onto Pikachu. Ash watched in horror as Mimikyu's hands began to bleed as he feverishly dug more sand. With a dark power welling up inside him, Pikachu smiled as he forced the Mimikyu to dig for him. The ghost Pokemon struggled feebly as it was digging its own grave. Slowly, the sand the Mimikyu was pulling up with its bloodied hands began to envelop him. Opening his sand-caked mouth, Pikachu began to feed on the Mimikyu. Within seconds, the ghost Pokemon was a shifting lump under the sand, consumed by Pikachu. Pikachu felt his body grow and shape into a strong fortress of sand. His anger was pulsing through his body like blood. He drained the ghost Pokemon of its essence. He could feel the surge of life revitalize his sandy walls. Wet blood oozed from the Mimikyu's corpse and was soaked up into the sand, strengthening the walls and towers. Pikachu felt his body begging to be unleashed. His mind was paralyzed with the desire to change and grow. The effaced form of the ghost Pokemon slipped deeper into the sand, and Pikachu's body desired more. He felt the call to change, a deafening thunder in his ears. Sand crumpled around Pikachu as his mind struggled against his body. The abhorrent mass of sand withered with greed and desire to shift and change. Unable to hold on to his thoughts, Pikachu felt the fuel of the change wash over his mind. He looked out to Ash as the sand washed his thoughts and memories away. Standing frozen in place, Ash watched as the Sandygast dragged the Mimikyu under the sand. His eyes glazed with fear and confusion. He saw the change grow from deep within the sand pile. Tall walls, crisp and beautiful, pushed through the mounds. Towers grew straight and high above the walls. And a great castle was birthed from the grains. Ash dropped to his knees and a tear welled from his eye. Pikachu watched as his trainer crumpled. He looked at Ash and sensed something different. Ash looked up to see the giant sand castle looming above him, the color of his flesh returning to him. He watched the hulking, evolved Palossand behind watery eyes. Pikachu's anger was replaced with a blue flush of passion as he saw Ash before him. He wanted to reach out and touch his best friend. Ash wiped the tears from his eyes and shook the power of the Mimikyu from his head. He stood up and stared at the Palossand. Pikachu fought back against the throbbing sensation of anger and betrayal coursing through his veins. He called out to Ash, screaming his name. Ash reached up and touched the sandy walls of the fortress. The dried sand crumpled and fell into a sad pile. He took a small handful of sand and clutched it close to his chest as tears again streamed from his eyes. He turned and walked away from the Palossand. Pikachu called to his trainer as he walked away. Fear, loneliness, terror, and confusion frothed through his head as he watched his best friend walk away. He could not follow this time, and watched the boy disappear into a horizon that never ended. Sparkling sand and stars reached out to oblivion as his eyes watched Ash get smaller and smaller. The sun grew red with passion, and people came out from all over Alola to watch as it fell from the sky. The moon crept up behind the trees, naked and flush with color. Boys and girls from all over the town lined the beach as they watched the ocean extinguish the sun. As the night sky yawned its gaping maw to consume Alola, the crowds thinned as they went back to their homes. Some of the more adventurous boys stuck around after the night claimed the sky to play on the beach. They saw a beautiful sandcastle protecting the trail leading out of the jungle. They besieged the castle, poking it with sticks, building mighty walls and knocking down tall towers, building it back up stronger than before. Each of the children then left, to fall down exhausted and sandy into their beds. But one boy stayed after the others left. He picked up a small red toy shovel that was uncovered from the sand. He dug into the soft beach and placed layers and layers of sand around the castle. He became feverish, and sweat began pouring from his brow as he continuously dug deeper and harder. The feeling of hunger chewed at his insides. He could feel the warmth of the boy's flesh, the heat of his breath as he panted. The palo sand sent out small tendrils of sand to wrap around the boy's legs and hands, guiding his body to feed his form. He watched all night long as he gluttonously fed on the little boy, his arms trembling and bleeding, his eyes and mouth dripping frothy red. The boy whined and murmured through choked breaths, and as the boy went limp, and the heat from his skin began to fade, the palo sand drew the boy into his sandy folds to feed. Thoughts of Ash and his dreams of running together on the sandy beaches of Alola, those nights before the terror blinked through Pikachu's mind, those memories were quickly replaced with the blissful feeling of greedy consumption.